I thought, I feel strong. I feel like my voice is going to hold out really well. I walked in the pulpit. I had an allergy attack, and I couldn't see, and I certainly couldn't talk. And so you get to thinking, well, maybe I need to step back and say, I'm not as well off as I thought I was. But anyway, there's several things that ran through my mind as I tried to get our lesson going this morning. But I hope as we read God's Word together that you got something out of that. As we go to the book of Proverbs in chapter 26, Solomon is going to focus his attention on how to deal with a fool. Now, why is that important? Before we ever read the very first verse, why is it important to know how to deal with a fool? Okay. But not us. What makes a person a fool? Okay, not following God's word. Basically, the fool is a person who does not consider the consequences. He acts without thinking. He goes in a direction without having first said, is this what God wants me to do? How does this turn out? And in that sense, how many of you have ever been a fool? You know, we don't want to say that because that's not really the place we want to find ourselves in. But what makes a person a fool is he acts foolish. And in that sense, most of us have at some point in our lives acted foolish. And there are other times in our lives we hope we have begun to start acting wiser as we've let God's word direct our lives. So Solomon now is trying to instruct in how to deal with a fool. And he's going to begin, first of all, in verse 1 by saying, as snow in summer and rain in harvest, so honor is not fitting for a fool. Now, I know most of you have already heard the forecast for this week. I watched it a little bit before I left services. I think tomorrow, Tuesday, and Wednesday are supposed to be 99 as air temperature, and the heat index from 107 to 110. How many of you expect to see snow this week? I don't think anybody does. He says it's snow in summer, and then notice rain in harvest. And for those of us who live here in Middle Tennessee, is it uncommon to have a rain come during harvest season? It's not unusual, not uncommon, but in the Bible lands, it is. There's a rainy season and a dry season, and harvest is the dry season. You can go passages, and I'll just put one here in the margin for you. In the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 12, and verses 17 and 18, you can read about that. So you got the illustration that he's using, talking about snow in summer, rain in harvest, but then he's going to talk about honor fitting for a fool. Is it fitting for it to snow in summer? No, that doesn't happen. Is it fitting for a fool to be honored? Well, Solomon is going to use the comparative on several occasions, and let's just look at some of them. In chapter 17 and verse 7, he said, excellent speech is not becoming to a fool, much less lying lips to a prince. How many of you would expect a man who's a fool to have a very eloquent, wise speech? Well, if he did that, he wouldn't be a fool, would he? Or if you go to chapter 19 and look at verse 10. He said, luxury is not fitting for a fool, much less for a servant to rule over princes. What do you mean by luxury? What are luxuries? Having the best? That's a really good way of putting it. Things that you don't need, but you want. Like, for instance, what do you have for food to live? Bread and water. How many of you like bread and water day after day after day? Every once in a while, you want something a little different. You remember the children of Israel as they were wandering in their wilderness wandering? They were eating manna every day, and what did they say? We're tired of this. But it was good. It was sweet cakes that they were making out of it. Do you think you'd ever get tired of eating donuts? After a while, do you think you might want something besides donuts? I know I would. And what they remembered was the melons, the leeks, the spices that they had, that their food had a little bit of, we would say, taste to it. Then after that, they wanted what else? Meat. Yeah, we're hungry. We want some meat. I dare say most of us men are a lot like that as well. You know, I enjoy the vegetables, but after a while, you want something that's, you feel like it's got some more substance to it. Well, those were luxuries that he's talking about. He says, it's not fitting for a fool to have luxuries because he doesn't deserve it. Well, that's where I think that you find the word here, honor, is not fitting for a fool. And as I start thinking about that, I think Solomon had it really well in Ecclesiastes. Let me write that down in case you're taking notes here. Chapter 10 and verses 5 through 7, where he says, there is an evil that I have seen under the sun. He said, an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a low place. I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground beside the servants. Well, what an interesting way to put it. You know, if you were thinking of a king or a powerful rich man coming, would you expect to see him leading the horse with the servant sitting on the horse? That just doesn't fit. Well, the application here is that it's inappropriate to honor a fool. And if I go back to chapter 25, thinking about Hezekiah's men who are copying these things, and you look at a fool, would it be wise for a king to take a fool and put honor on him? No. Now you start saying, well, why? Well, he doesn't deserve that. You are only encouraging him to keep on his folly. If you honor a person who's done badly, what happens if you reward your children for bad behavior? They'll keep doing it. Let's say, for instance, you tell your kids start with, if you bring home A's, I'm going to give you a $20 bill. You bring home B's, I'm going to give you a $10 bill. Bring home C's, I'm going to give you a $5 bill. Bring home anything less than a C, I'm not going to give you anything. Okay, your kids come home from school and they got 3 F's and 2 D's. You say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. I'm going to go ahead and give you a 20 anyway. What have you done? You've enabled, that's the word. You've enabled them to think that's okay, to keep doing what they've been doing. What happens if you honor a fool? He's going to stay thinking, hey, being foolish pays. It's worth honor. And you also tell other people that's worthy. Okay, let's go to verse 2 then. Like a flitting sparrow, like a flying swallow, so a curse without a cause shall not alight. That's an interesting way of putting it. But to understand what he's saying, you got to understand what a flitting sparrow and a flying swallow are. Now, there are birds that are different. Some birds fly in patterns. How many of you have looked up and seen a flock of geese flying over? How do they fly? Beautiful V-shaped pattern. You know, times of the year, they know when it's supposed to go. How many of you have ever noticed these dumb little birds under the driveway out here? I call them dumb little birds because I can't get rid of them. I tear their nest out. One day, it's built back that afternoon. Those are actually called barn swallows, which happen to be the flying swallow. You know what happens? You walk out there, and they see me drive up, and they start flying directly toward me. And then when they get about 5 feet away from me, they turn real quick. They have no flying pattern. It's random. The flitting sparrow and the flying swallow both do not have flying patterns. They're just random. They go any direction whatsoever. And then you say, oh, I think I see the meaning of the parable now, the meaning of the proverb. So a curse without a cause. You see, they fly without a cause. They're just flying any direction, every direction, in contrast to like geese or ducks or other migratory birds that tend to fly in patterns. They have a purpose. They have a cause. They know where they're going, and they know why they're going there. Well, if you have a curse and it doesn't have the right cause, now what does the word alight mean? Now, what does the word alight mean? It's going to land somewhere. Okay, if I pronounce a curse and I don't have a cause behind it, then it's not going to land anywhere. And that raises to me a real interesting one. Let's go to the book of Numbers for just a second. Numbers chapter 23 and verse 8. Numbers 23 relates to Balaam and Balak. Do you know what Balak wanted Balaam to do? Curse Israel. Now, why curse Israel? Did Israel deserve to be cursed? They were afraid of him, but did they do anything wrong? No, they didn't. Well, in Numbers 23, verse 8, Balaam says, how shall I curse whom God has not cursed? And how shall I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? That's an interesting way of putting it. If there is not a reason to curse these people, God has not condemned them, what good is it to do any cursing? None whatsoever. Now, how might this relate to a fool? Oh, this is where you got to put your thinking cap on. No reason whatsoever. Here's a king, and a man is griping and complaining and cursing, but he doesn't have any legitimate complaint. Let me ask you, in our country today, do we have people who are just mad for no good reason whatsoever? I mean, are we living in a time when there's a lot of animosity? Is there any reason for this animosity? Real reason. Is there a reason to hate your brother? Is there a reason to go and say, I'm going to kill you because I don't like you? No. And the foolish person has not thought through to say, does this person deserve to be cursed? No, he doesn't. Well, then why am I doing? And what he's saying is just like those birds that just fly in any direction. If you have anybody who's just saying anything, everything, then he says that curse will not alight. It won't land and it won't be where it's supposed to be. That's majority of the people, they don't understand one another. And so for that, there's a lot of malice and ill will and hatred. Okay, let's go to verse 3. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, and a rod for the fool's back. Now, he's got two animals here, and I would probably have thought that the means of correction would have been reversed. I would have thought the bridle would have been for the horse and the whip for the donkey, but Solomon puts it this way. What is a whip for? Correction? It is a means of motivation, whether it's to correct or to direct, I guess is the other term, is a person will apply this whip. Now, what's a bridle for? Direction. And so you put the bridle in and you want them to turn right, they're going to turn right. You want them to turn left, they're going to turn left. So when you say a whip for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, you have both motivation and direction. In other words, you're going to turn him, you're going to move him. Well, what does he use for the fool? An attitude adjustment. Well, let me offer you some passages which I think can be helpful. The book of Psalms, chapter 32 and verse 9 says, "Do not be like the horse or like the mule, which have no understanding, which must be harnessed with bit and bridle, or else they will not come near you." Animals have to be directed. You don't give them directions and they won't obey you. What about a fool? They've got to have directions too, because they don't have any understanding either. They don't know what they're doing. Now, Solomon will then talk about physical punishment for the foolish. He said in Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 13, "Wisdom is found on the lips of him who has understanding, but a rod is for the back of him who is devoid of understanding." And in chapter 17 and verse 10, he said, "Rebuke is more effective for a wise man than 100 blows on a fool." So, is it wrong to have physical punishment for a child or an adult? Now, several years ago, I'm sure it's probably been 30 years ago now, y'all remember there was a young man who went over to one of the Southeast Asian islands. I want to think it's Malaysia or Singapore, one of those countries. And they caned him. You know what caning is? That they used a cane as a means of a rod, and they beat him, that young man. And I'm not sure what he did right now, just off the top of my head, but I remember there was an outrage. How dare they beat this young man? Maybe it was putting graffiti on a wall or something in another country. You know, there are some countries take doing things like that a whole lot more seriously than people in our country do. And their laws say, you do this, this is what you're going to. Do you imagine that young man say, hey, you know what, I'm going to go back over there and I'm going to do that again? He probably doesn't want to go back anymore. No punishment. I'm wondering if our country actually practiced some sort of physical punishment as a part of our correction system, if it might not have a more effective, there was time they used to have to break rocks, and there was a time when they used to have to do manual labor as a means of punishment. But, sometimes you have to learn. And Solomon is saying here, that's the only way some people will learn. And we understand that, at least I think most of us understand that with our children, but some people never grow up. And they have to have that same sort of correction, guidance, and training to make them do what is right. I remember my ag teacher when I was probably 10th, 11th, 12th grade, really good man, honorable character man. He'd have this big, huge paddle, and he'd say, now, folks, I don't want to use it, but I will. And usually there's one smart aleck boy near the beginning of school who wanted to test him. And I remember seeing one young man who thought he was really tough, and he was told to grab his ankles, and he picked him up off the floor with that paddle. He didn't have to paddle anybody else all year long. And the reason why is people saw that's, maybe if people saw some correction, it would be prohibitive for others doing that. Now I want to get to verses 4 and 5. This is the section that I've been sort of focusing our attention. I'll read verses 4 and 5 together. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him. Verse 5, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Now, is Solomon contradicting himself? Now, if Solomon had put verse 4 at the beginning of the book and verse 5 near the end of the book, you might have said, well, he was somehow, just didn't get it right. Even though those of us who believe in inspiration, that wouldn't be the case. But some critics of the Bible would say that. But putting these verses back to back tells you what? What does it tell you? He did it on purpose. It's a situation where you have something that's sort of like a paradox, something that doesn't seem to fit together. Well, let's look and see what he says here in verse 4. Okay. Well, in both of them, it is how I relate to them. What am I going to do to a man who is a fool? Well, let's look at verse 4. Do not answer a fool according to his folly. Now, notice, we've got to look at these words, do not answer, and then we got to look at this word, according to his folly. And then the reason, lest you also be like him. Now, when you have a fool and you answer him, what do you mean answer? What is an answer? Respond. Do not respond to a fool according to his folly. Now, when I say according to his folly, what does that mean? Like him. The way he used his reasoning. The reason being is lest you also be like him. Explain to me what that means. Lest you also be like him. You both end up like pigs. I've often heard also, he who lives in glass houses should what? Not throw rocks. If you're in a glass house and you say, quit throwing rocks, well, make me. All right, let me pick up some rocks and throw at you. That just seems to be ridiculous and foolish. and doesn't make good sense. You get on his plane, on his level, and then what do you become when you start doing what he does? You become a fool. You'll be like him. And but how many person has been drawn into a conflict with a foolish person? Here's a guy who says something stupid, and what do you think that you ought to do? Not agree with him, but I'm going to tell you, this to me has Facebook written all over it. I mean, I'm serious. You know, there's somebody says something just ridiculously stupid on Facebook, and you know what the first thing somebody else feels like they got to do? Respond to it. And the next thing you know, about 20 posts later, you're like, I don't forgot which one of them was the crazy one. I about decided they're both crazy now. Absolutely. I can't tell you the number of people that I know that will goad you. There's a preacher, he's not in McMinnville, but he lives in the area here, and he's well noted for trying to goad people into a conflict. And I remember not too long ago, one of the brothers who didn't know him looked at me and says, "What's going on?" I said, "He's trying his best to get a fuss started." I said, "Just ignore him." And he said, "All right." And so he tried to get one started. Nobody would bite. And you know what happened? He was like, wah, wah. You know, nobody paid any attention to me. But that's what Solomon says. You don't answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him. Well, notice what he says in verse 5. Answer a fool according. First he said, don't answer him, and now he says, answer him. But he says, notice again, according to his folly. Now that's where I think you have to understand he's using the term according to his folly in two different ways. You don't answer him on the way he's speaking to you, but you answer him according to the way he's talking. And he says, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Is there a time to tell a man who is being foolish, you need to be quiet? What about elders who have somebody who are creating conflict in the congregation? Remember what Titus chapter 1 says? Whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things they ought not for the sake of dishonest gain. Sometimes the elders have to look at people and say, you know what? We don't want you bringing that mess in here. We don't want you creating this kind of conflict, this foolishness. In Proverbs 17 and verse 14, the beginning of strife is like the releasing of water. Therefore, stop contention before a quarrel starts. You know that a man's starting something. What would you do as a parent if one of your children started a fuss and you knew that's what they were fixing to do, is start a fuss? Okay? Be quiet. Well, can you give me an example of someone who answered a fool according to his folly? Well, let me give you. What's that? Okay, force and attitude. But can you think of a specific? Let's go to the book of Jude for just a second. We don't use the book of Jude much, but let's go to Jude verse 9. I always try to find good biblical illustrations of the principles that are being used. And here's what it says. Yet Michael the archangel, in contending with the devil, when he disputed about the body of Moses, dared not bring against him a reviling accusation, but said, the Lord rebuke you. Now notice, Michael's an archangel, Satan is the devil, And they're disputing about the body of Moses. And somebody says, well, what kind of dispute were they having? That's not the point. It's not why Jude brings it up. In the context, Jude is talking about people who are subverting the church. They're doing it in two different ways. Number one, they're teaching things they ought not. That's back in verse 3. But number two, he says these are spots in your love feast. They're creating conflict when you have a fellowship meal together. Now, he said you want to look at the way to handle things. How did Michael handle the fool, the devil? Did he get in an argument with him? He said he did not bring against him a reviling accusation. What is a reviling accusation? Okay. Reviling accusation is you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about. You cast aspersion on the other person, upon their motives, upon the way they think, about how intelligent they are. He didn't do that. He just said, the Lord rebuke you. That's enough. Now, let's go to Matthew chapter 21. Matthew chapter 21. And let's go to verse 24. And it's interesting when you put all this together. They're asking Jesus by what authority he was doing these things. Who gave him that authority? And Jesus said to them, I also will ask you one thing, which if you will tell me, I will likewise tell you by what authority I do these things. You think about the way the Lord answered that question. He put them on the spot and say, okay, you want me to answer a question? I'll be glad to answer your question if you'll answer this one. Sometimes you answer a fool according to his folly that you have to expose his folly. You have to show that he's the one who's trying to reason incorrectly. Now, if you go all the way to verse 22 of chapter 22 of Matthew, it says, when they heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. It's interesting. You have people want to argue with Jesus, and when Jesus responds, not in a harsh, ungodly way, but he responds in a reasoned way, like, how are you going to deal with that? So they just left him, went their way, and did not follow that. So you look at verses 4 and 5 together, and you see and appreciate the way that the Lord tells us to deal with people who act foolish. Now let's go to verse 6. I'm going to run out of time. He who sends a message by the hand of a fool cuts off his own feet and drinks violence. Now, when you send a message, why would a person send a message to somebody else? To warn them? Let's say you've got a king who has another king in another city far away, and he's going to send a message to him. Maybe his message is, I don't want to go to war with you. Or maybe the message is, if your people don't stop coming into our area and raiding our fields, we're going to go to war with one another. In other words, he's sending a message to convey something that is important. How foolish is it to send a fool? You just as well not send anyone, because when he gets there, he may not tell what you told, and he may not tell it the way that you intended it to be told. And so he says the person who does that, he says, cuts off his own feet. Now, we don't necessarily put it like that today. We said a person cuts off their nose, despite their face. That's the way we would express the same, but it's the same idea here, is that a person's cutting their legs off and doing that. But he also says they drink violence. It's going to come back to you. It's going to make you drink that cup of wrath that you didn't want to drink. Solomon's already talked about this earlier. In chapter 10 and verse 26, he said, as vinegar is to the teeth and smoke is to the eyes, so is the lazy man to those who send him. And in chapter 25 and verse 13, he says, like cold snow in the time of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him, where he refreshes the souls of his masters. So his message is, don't be foolish enough to send a fool to carry your message. Now I want to get verse 7 before we lose the time this morning. Like the legs of the lame hang limp is a proverb in the mouth of fools. Now, what do you mean, legs of the lame hang limp? They're useless. You know, a person who has had an accident, or maybe who was born with their legs damaged, and they get ready to get into an automobile or into a chair, what do they have to do with those legs? Okay? Most of the time, they have to pick them up. You know, I've seen people who have been paralyzed, and, you know, they will slide. I had an uncle who was paralyzed from the waist down. He would slide into the vehicle, and then he'd have to reach out and grab one leg, pull it in, reach out and grab the other leg. They hang limp. They're just there. But he says, that's the same as a proverb in the mouth of a fool. Now, what's the balance of this? Yeah. It has no value. Just like those limbs that have no value, you put a proverb in the mouth of a fool, it doesn't do any good there. You mean like you take a verse out of context and use it the way it was never intended to be used? You see the point I'm trying to make. There's an application of this proverb here. If you go back to chapter 17, just a second here. Go back to chapter 17 and you look at verse 16. He says, why is there in the hand of the fool the purchase price of wisdom, since he has no heart for it? If you've got a guy who does not know how to use money, and all of a sudden you give him a whole lot of money, what does he do with it? Well, you think about some of these athletes who were raised in poverty, and then all of a sudden they sign a bonus, and signing bonus, and they get $15 million. What do they do many times? They blow it. They spend more than they have. But it's obvious that they have no understanding of the value of that money. They don't understand how hard it is for a normal person to work to have that amount of money in their entire life. And I would suggest to you the same thing is true here of a fool when you put a proverb in his mouth. He doesn't understand the benefit that it can have. If you use a proverb with your children, and which I would suggest you ought to be studying the book of Proverbs with your children. I hope that as we've studied through this, you've said, oh boy, there's a really good one to use with your kids. But as you use those, you want to do so that they learn something for the future, and that it has an application to their life. Well, I'm going to do one more because, Kurt's coming now. Maybe I ought to just stop with this. Does anybody have any comment on verse 7? It doesn't work. Well, I appreciate that. We'll pick up with verse 8 next Sunday morning.